All right, guys, today we're going to be looking at indicator 8.1, which is all about the civil rights movement. Um, Before we get going, though, with this indicator, this is probably going to be divided up into two parts because there's so much information in this indicator. So, this is going to be part one. Um, there are a few questions that you should be able to answer after going over part one and part two of this indicator. Let's look at these questions though before we start, and I would like for you to write these questions down. You can write them down now, or you can go back and write them down at the ending of the video as well. But let's go through these questions. The first question is, what was life like for African Americans before the Civil Rights Movement? Explain the strategies of the civil rights movement. Explain the purpose of the NAACP. What was Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education? Explain the Little Rock Nine. Explain legislation to help the civil rights movement. Explain Black Power, Malcolm X, and the Black Panthers. Explain differences in segregation in the North and the South. What were the political divides during the civil rights movement? And why did the women's rights movement take off during the civil rights movement? So I'd like for you to be able to answer these by the time that you're done with both of these parts of this video lecture series. But again, you can either write them down now, or once the video is over with, you can write them down then. Okay, so with that being said, let's get into the civil rights movement. Most of this is taking place in the late 1950s, 1960s is going to be when the majority of these events and things are occurring within the United States. So before the movement, what was life like for many African Americans? And this goes back to some things that we've already previously discussed. Of course, with the Jim Crow laws, remember after the Civil War, the literacy test, and all these things that were put into place to try to prohibit blacks from getting their rights and being able to vote and so on. So the goals of the African Americans during this civil rights movement are going to be that they want equal treatment, which they weren't getting due to some of those things that we've talked about previously. And they also wanted the right to vote. So those were the two main goals for African Americans during this civil rights movement. Of course, there had been things that had been done to try to help African Americans during this period after the Civil War, leading up to the Civil Rights Movement. The 13th through the 15th Amendments, of course, were things that were put in place to help African Americans. Franklin Roosevelt, you need to write this one down too, especially. The Fair Employment Practices Commission was formed by Franklin Roosevelt. Again, this gave jobs during World War II to African Americans. Remember that a lot of the soldiers were white and they went off to war, and some of the African American men were left behind. And so they opened up those jobs to African Americans. So, again, this was one attempt to try to help improve things. President Truman's Civil Rights Commission was formed. It created anti-lynching laws and a desegregation of the military at that point. So President Truman's Civil Rights Commission, also another way or another attempt to try to ease some of the problems that African Americans were having. Some of the strategies of the civil rights movement, let's look at some of those things. And probably the most well-known figure of the civil rights movement, of course, is this man here, Martin Luther King. You definitely want to know him, write down his name, make sure you're familiar with him. Martin Luther King's approach involved nonviolence, not reacting to violent acts. So he preached all about nonviolence. He also believed in civil disobedience. And what civil disobedience is, you need to write this down too, is refusing to comply with a rule or law peacefully. And of course, Martin Luther King is doing these things peacefully without violence. He modeled himself after Gandhi, of course, in India, which we touched on last year in your world history classes. Some other things that were formed during this period was the SCLC, which is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, again, meeting to discuss problems that African Americans were having and pushing to get some of these things changed. We also had the SNCC, which was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Again, along the same lines as the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, but again, their goal was to ensure that African Americans should get and have the rights that that were needed at that point. Okay, so strategies: Martin Luther King, the formation of these two organizations, the SCLC and the SNCC, were all strategies and things used to try to promote civil rights for African Americans during this period. A group that really emerges strong during the civil rights movement is going to be the NAACP. And what the NAACP stands for is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. This group begins to grow. They feel like they can have strength in numbers. They started trying to establish some sort of judicial precedent. And what a precedent is something that serves as a rule for future rulings in court cases. And the NAACP tried to push some of these things. They took on racial cases. Probably one of the most important ones that they actually dealt with is going to be Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education. Thurgood Marshall is going to play a major role in the NAACP. Here he is pictured here. But again, NAACP trying to help African Americans, trying to establish judicial precedents, and taking on racial cases in courts to try to free up those rights that African Americans so desperately wanted during this period. Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education is probably one of the most historic cases that the Supreme Court is going to rule on. Here are the gist or the background of this. Linda Brown was denied admission to an all-white school 4 blocks from her home. The closest black school was 21 blocks away. So naturally, Linda Brown's going to want to go to the school that's closest. Unfortunately for her, it was a white school. And at this time, we had segregation, meaning that blacks and whites were divided. Thurgood Marshall, who we saw in the previous slide, was the attorney from the NAACP at this point. He is going to go into this case, and there's going to be a 9-0 ruling saying that racial segregation in public schools has a detrimental effect on minority children. So it's ruling against segregation. In other words, separate but equal is not equal. And we've talked about that too in the past. Remember Plessy versus Ferguson and some of those other cases that we've discussed. But anyway, separate but equal is not equal. And Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education strikes down segregation when the Supreme Court makes this ruling. Another very important event that occurs during the Civil Rights Movement involves a group known as the Little Rock Nine. In 1954, the school board is going to try to integrate schools in Arkansas. In 1957, 9 African Americans wanted to attend Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. They're going to be denied. And President Eisenhower orders them to be escorted by federal troops due to whites protesting. And so he sends in the federal army to actually escort these 9 students into the school in Little Rock, Arkansas. So again, troops had been there denying them entry, and now troops are sent in to make sure that they do enter. So pretty ironic that took place. But again, Little Rock Nine, make sure you're familiar with them, know what happened, and understand the importance of allowing these 9 African Americans into this all-white school in Arkansas. A couple of other things that I want you to know, and you can jot these down too, some things that were done during the during the Civil Rights Movement. Of course, the Woolworth sit-ins, where college students went into Woolworths, which was segregated, and they didn't allow blacks to sit at the counters. They actually went and sat down. This was in North Carolina, I believe in Durham. The Montgomery bus boycott. Of course, this starts with Rosa Parks getting on the bus, not wanting to sit at the back of the bus. Again, another part of the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King's Selma March in Selma, Alabama. The March on Washington with Martin Luther King giving his "I Have a Dream" speech. The Children's March, also known as the Birmingham Campaign. And then the Freedom Riders, blacks and whites, riding buses to the South to attend the conference. So all of these were nonviolent strategies that were imposed during the Civil Rights Movement. A couple of civil rights legislations that I want you to know about would include the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And what the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is going to say is that it's going to prohibit the discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. So that is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Make sure that you know that. It is putting an end to the Jim Crow laws that had plagued the South for so long. So this is a federal act. So these southern states are going to have to follow these acts. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlawed discrimination in voting practices, and it echoed the 15th Amendment, which we've discussed in the past as well. So no more literacy tests, no more any of that kind of stuff. And you can see some of these pictures here. This woman's holding up an end of the literacy test poster and so on. So again, these pieces of legislation were the first pieces of legislation to actually address segregation and to address discrimination, and especially with voting rights. So we see that taking place during the 1960s during this movement. Black Power, we've seen a few things in the past about this, and you've probably had it in some other classes. This was a movement in the late 1960s. It advocated that African Americans establish control of their political and economic life, that they should take control of that part. One of the main leaders of this Black Power movement is going to be this man, Malcolm X. He is an activist leader. He's going to lead this during this period. Stokely Carmichael is another man that you need to be familiar with. Stokely is spelled Stokely, and then Carmichael, Carmichael. He is the person that is responsible for coining the term Black Power. He worked with Martin Luther King initially, and he's going to break off. He's going to be divided against the nonviolence movement. Again, the Black Panthers are going to emerge during this period. They instilled riots, and they used rhetoric to undermine the public and governmental support of Martin Luther King's nonviolent movement. So they were actually against Martin Luther King. They thought the only way they were going to get justice and get the rights that they deserve was mainly through violence. So again, Black Panthers, just make sure that you're familiar with them. Okay, that is going to end part one. We'll pick up part two tomorrow. What I'd like for you to do is go back and answer some of these questions that lead up to Black Power. If you go back, and we'll scroll back real quick and look at these questions, you'll stop here where it says explain Black Power, Malcolm X, and the Black Panthers. Make sure that you write these questions down. You've answered them thoroughly and fully, and that you have these notes. When you are done with these notes, you must bring your paper to me so I can initial it. If you do not do that, then I think it is not done, and I'll have to put in a grade, and it won't be a good grade. So please make sure that you bring these notes to me once you have finished. Okay, that's going to do it. We'll pick up with part two, where we talk about some of the things that are going to be influenced by the civil rights movement and some other things, and finish this indicator up on 8.1. Okay, we'll catch you on the next one.